What is going on, everybody? What is going on, the catch fam? My name is John Dawson, and in today's video we are hopping into my starts and sits for the tight end position for week 5 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in, hit that subscribe button if you're new to the channel. It really does help us out when you guys hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel. Feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below, and I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, Thursday night football, we've got the Colts at the Broncos. Listen, there's not really tight ends in this matchup that I'm a huge fan of, but we should keep an eye on Mo Alley-Cox of the Indianapolis Colts. He's definitely touchdown dependent, but he did have 2 scores last week versus Tennessee. But with that being said, we saw Jelani Woods the week before in week 3 against Kansas City have 2 scores as well. So it's at least apparent that Matt Ryan is going to target the tight end position. Kylen Granson also had 10.2 fantasy points, 62 receiving yards off 4 receptions in week 4. So listen here, there's nothing consistent from a fantasy football perspective with the 3 tight ends on the Colts, but they're worth at least keeping an eye on in case we do see a consistent pattern emerge out of one of them. But I definitely don't want to start any of them in this matchup Thursday night football. Moving on to the Broncos tight ends, I'm sitting Albert O. I'm not starting any of the Broncos tight ends at the end of the day. There's nothing to discuss here. They have not in any way, shape, or form been productive from a fantasy perspective. And really in these tight end videos, if there is not a player to start on a respective team at the position, I'm just going to move right along. So I'm sitting Alberto, I'm sitting the Broncos tight ends. Let's move on to the next matchup. All right, Giants at Packers. There's no way in the world I am starting a Giants tight end. Daniel Jones may not even be playing in this game at the quarterback position. There's no reason whatsoever to consider a Giants tight end moving into week 5. Robert Tonyan, on the other hand, I think is a decent streaming option overall. I think this is a good matchup for the Packers. I think they are in need of one of those statement type victory games after having an overtime bare minimum victory against the New England Patriots, who had their 3rd string quarterback in week 3. Robert Tonyan had a good game overall last week, his first touchdown on the season. He's had at least 9 fantasy points in the last 2 games. It's a good matchup, a good game script. I think if you don't have better options, you can definitely consider Robert Tonyan moving into week 5. All right, Lions at Patriots. I would start TJ Hawkinson. He's coming in as your tight end number 3 overall in full PPR, and I completely understand that ranking is 100% elevated by the 39.9 fantasy performance that he had in week 4 against the Seahawks. Before that, he had 7.8 points in week 1, 5.6 in week 2, 10.8 in week 3, respectively. He did miss practice on Wednesday at the time that I am recording this. He is questionable at the moment with a hip injury, but we do see a lot of injuries pop up for players like TJ Hawkinson. But we just talked about Robert Tonyan, who had a good game against the Patriots. The Patriots defense is one of the worst defenses from a fantasy perspective against the tight end position. So if Hawkinson is healthy and does suit up, I absolutely love him again here in week 5, and there is a chance that Amon-Ra St. Brown and or DJ Chark and even DeAndre Swift miss this game, so there should be more targets to go around for Hawkinson. I think Hawkinson is a strong start if he is healthy moving in to week 5. Moving on to the Patriots tight ends, I am sitting Hunter Henry. I've seen his name kind of circulating around in the fantasy community, guys. He has 9.1 fantasy points through 4 games to start the season. Guys, I was a huge fan of Hunter Henry as a late round draft selection at the position, and I really only liked them if Mac Jones was the quarterback, and I don't think Mac Jones is even going to be the quarterback Sunday. But on top of that, he has not been productive. I'm scared of this offense outside of the running backs that want nothing to do with Hunter Henry moving into week 5. All right, Chargers at Browns. Gerald Everett comes in as your tight end 6 in full PPR, 14 points in week 1, 13 in week 2, just 4.5 in week 3, but then 17 last week against Houston. He had a touchdown, 61 receiving yards, and 5 receptions. Everett is a start week in and week out. I mean, even if Keenan Allen comes back healthy and takes away some targets, I really think that Everett and Herbert have established a nice chemistry, and he has a good role within this offense. Until we see a massive decrease in production, I don't think there's any reason to sit Gerald Everett on a weekly basis. David Njoku, on the other hand, kind of came back to earth in week 4, going from 23.9 points in week 3 to 9.7 in week 4, but it was still a good performance. Overall, he had 73 receiving yards off 5 receptions. He is dealing with a sore knee at the moment. I mean, these, injuries are going to pop up all throughout the year for different tight ends. I do think Njoku is worth a start in this matchup. I just really like the game script involved here. I think this is one of the better matchups from a fantasy perspective moving into week 5. So I think if you don't have better options, Njoku is perfectly fine here in week 5. All right, Texans at Jaguars. I'm sitting Brevin Jordan. No reason to consider a Texans tight end moving into week 5 of the season. I think Evan Ingram is a decent stream. I have an asterisk here because he's definitely not my favorite stream on the week, but if you're in a deep enough league, a full PPR league as well, and you don't have better options, I think Evan Ingram's okay. I mean, we had the touchdown that was called back in week 3, and outside of that, he doesn't have a touchdown on the season. 6.8 fantasy points in week 1, 11.6 in week 2, but then just 3.9 in week 3, 2.6 in week 4. So I'm hoping he can bounce back against the Houston Texans here in week 5 and at least put up a semi-respectable stat line like we saw in week 1 or week 2, which was pretty good overall at 11.6. But overall, like I said, he's not my favorite stream. There's going to be other streaming options throughout the video that I like a lot more. But if you're in a desperate enough situation, I think the Jaguars are in line for a good week. So there's a chance that Ingram has a pretty good day overall and maybe finds the end zone here in week 5. All right, Falcons at Buccaneers. Kyle Pitts owners, I know you guys are just feeling a lot of pain. I know a lot of you guys have been asking me questions throughout the week. Should I start Kyle Pitts? Should I trade Kyle Pitts? What do I do here? Do I just sit him? I mean, some of you guys have better options. Maybe you have a Gerald Everett, right? Maybe you have a Tyler Conklin. Someone has come along and helped you through. Maybe you've traded Kyle Pitts, whatever it may be. Listen, I'll say this much, guys. It's been a really disappointing season. 3.9 fantasy points or less in 3 out of his first 4 games. 13.7 against Seattle. I mean, that was a high-scoring game. With all that being said, the Buccaneers defense from a fantasy perspective has been really bad against opposing tight ends. If it wasn't for that, I'd probably sit Kyle Pitts. The other factor here is that Cordell Patterson is going to miss the next 4 weeks, so that dynamic is taken away from this Falcons offense. I think that is positive for Kyle Pitts. Should lead to more targets theoretically. Pitts comes in as your tight end 18 overall. I do think he could have a decent week here in week 5. I like him a lot more in week 5 versus week 6 against San Francisco. So if Kyle Pitts is your tight end 1, you don't think there's better streaming options, I think he's okay here in week 5, but just get ready for a lot of inconsistency and a lot of bad ceilings on the season if you're holding on to Kyle Pitts, unless something drastically changes within this offense. But with Patterson out in a good matchup, at least against the tight end position, I think Pitts is okay here in week 5. Nothing to discuss in terms of the Buccaneers tight ends. We're not starting any of them there. All sits moving into week 5. All right, Steelers at Bills. Pat Freiermuth, man, quietly your tight end 7 in full PPR, at least 12 fantasy points in 3 out of his 4 matchups on the season. So far, he has 223 receiving yards and 1 score, 18 receptions through the first 4 games. I like Freiermuth on a weekly basis. I don't really care who he's going up against. I will say the quarterback change from Mitchell Trubisky to Kenny Pickett could affect things here, right? We don't really know the full amount of chemistry that Freiermuth and Pickett have, but hey, I'm still rolling with Pat Freiermuth. I think he'll be just fine moving into week 5. Believe it or not, I've got Dawson Knox as a sit. He is questionable at the moment, so he may or may not play. He's coming in as your tight end 23, guys. Like, if you own Dawson Knox, you don't think there's any other tight end you can pick up, he's your only option. At the end of the day, he's still on the Buffalo Bills offense. He has a chance at a good stat line, but so far on the season, he has not scored more than 8.1 fantasy points. He has not had more than 41 receiving yards in a single game. He has not had more than 4 receptions in a single game. Guys, I loved Dawson Knox coming into the season, but we just have not seen it happen. I'm really hoping this can turn around. Overall, I think he's a sit for most fantasy managers. I think most fantasy managers who own Dawson Knox have picked up another tight end. At this point, I think there's better streaming options. You roll with one of them. I think if Knox is your only option, you just cross your fingers that the Bills light up the Steelers, and Dawson Knox is a bigger part of the offensive game plan than he has been so far on the season. Dolphins at Jets. Mike Gesicki's a sit here, but I would also consider him a semi-watch because I do think that there's potential that Teddy Bridgewater wants to target the tight end position. I don't know for sure. It's just possible is all I'm saying. But overall in the season, he's your tight end 27. 14.1 points in week 2. But outside of that, he has not scored more than 4.3 fantasy points in a single matchup this week. He's a sit for me. But keep an eye on him just in case that chemistry changes with Teddy B at the quarterback position. Tyler Conklin is a start for me. We get Zach Wilson at the quarterback position. I told you guys Conklin definitely has a potential to dip down, moving from Flacco to Zach Wilson in week 4. But overall, he did enough in this game. 8.2 fantasy points, 3 receptions off 5 targets, 52 receiving yards. He's still your tight end 9 in full PPR. So a lot of you guys held on to Tyler Conklin, which I was fine with. And listen, it's not the best matchup versus Miami's defense, but overall, even if the ceiling's not too high, I think Conklin is a start moving into week 5. Bears at Vikings. I'm sitting Cole Kmet. I really, in my eyes, there's nothing to talk about here. He had an okay week in week 3 with 7 fantasy points against Houston. Outside of that game, he has 4.6 fantasy points combined in the 3 other games so far he's played in on the season. So it's not looking good for Cole Kmet. We all know, right? Cole Kmet has just been absolutely disappointing at the tight end position here in the 2022 fantasy football season. He continues to be a sit for me. All right, Irv Smith had 14.6 fantasy points in week 2 against Philly. He really lit up in terms of like buzz around the fantasy community. A lot of you guys are asking me questions about Irv Smith, and I just wasn't quite there. I liked him as a streaming option versus Detroit because of the potential game script. Only had 5.2 fantasy points in week 3. After that, he was basically downgraded as a sit for me from a stream. And he had 5.3 fantasy points against New Orleans in week 4. Believe it or not, Chicago's playing pretty good against the tight end position overall. So I think he's a sit here. Just way too of a boomer bust type player at the position. So I've got him as a sit moving into week 5. Titans at Commanders. No reason to discuss the Titans tight ends. They have done nothing whatsoever from a fantasy perspective all across the board. So Austin Hooper and any other Titans tight ends a sit for me in week 5. Logan Thomas, I think, is an okay streaming option. I do like this matchup overall for the Commanders. He's still coming in as tight end 16 overall in full PPR. You know, weeks 3 and 4 were not nearly as great as weeks 1 and 2, but Philly and Dallas respectively have, you know, good defenses overall. I do think it's a better opportunity for Logan Thomas moving into week 5 against the Tennessee Titans. I think it's a pretty good game script actually for both sides. It's not the tight end position for the Titans, so I think Thomas is a decent streaming option. Not my favorite necessarily, but he's perfectly fine if you're absolutely desperate and don't have better options moving into week 5. Seahawks at Saints. Listen guys, Will Dissly is a stream for me, but I was tempted to put Dissly down as a start. This is your tight end 10 in full PPR. He has a touchdown in 3 of the first 4 games on the season. Him and Geno Smith look like they have a great chemistry. He's only having about 3 receptions per game on the season, but he's making the most of them. He has double-digit fantasy performances in 3 of the first 4 games on the season. It's not the greatest matchup against the Saints. They're a top 5 unit overall, not necessarily from a fantasy perspective, but overall, I get it. But man, Will Dissly is actually kind of balling right now. I mean, the Seahawks team is pretty unique overall with Geno Smith at the quarterback position, and Will Dissly is a big factor in that regard. So I like him as a streaming option. He's actually probably one of my favorite streaming options moving in to week 5. I would definitely keep an eye on him. He is probably available in your league, and if you're in a bad position, I mean, he's literally rostered in 13% of fantasy leagues right now. I mean, I get it, guys. He's touchdown dependent, don't get me wrong, but like the touchdowns have been there so far. So if you're in a bad position, I definitely consider Will Dissly. Nothing to really talk about in terms of these Saints tight ends. I mean, if you're in a league where you can play Taysom Hill at the tight end position, you can always roll the dice there, but he is dealing with a rib injury. Juwan Johnson had 6.3 fantasy points, full PPR against Minnesota in week 4. He's probably better when Winston's on the field, but overall, he hasn't been consistent enough. So for me, I'm sitting the Saints tight ends, moving it to week 5. All right, Niners at Panthers. What do we do with George Kittle, guys? 6.8 fantasy points in week 3, 4.4 in week 4. Overall, the Panthers are a pretty average defense. I don't know. I mean, I've got him as a sit. He just hasn't been involved. 9 total targets through the last 2 weeks. Like, all it's going to take is one big game for Kittle to pop and for us to want to consider him on a weekly basis, because he at least gives us that ceiling, right? And he had plenty of games last year where we were like, what is going on? But overall, I need to see the consistent pattern emerge. Like, listen, if you want to roll a dice on Kittle, I'm not going to argue with it whatsoever. It's George Kittle. I get it. But I just think if you have one of those streaming options on your roster, and since Kittle missed the first 2 weeks, you probably do, or maybe you traded for an additional tight end, whatever it may be, I think maybe you continue to roll with them. And like, I don't know if it's going to necessarily make or break you, right? But if we start to see Kittle get into that double-digit range, like he's going to become a starter just because the ceiling's too high, like I said. But I mean, guys, I just don't know. Let me know in the comments down below. Like, if you own Kittle, are you confident in starting him? Because a lot of you guys in our fantasy Q&A live streams have been telling me, like, you're not confident in it. I don't blame you. I'm not really confident in starting him either. I mean, this team is based on the defense and based on the run game and Deebo Samuel. And I mean, we want to see Kittle get involved, don't get me wrong, but at the moment, you know, overall in this season with just 11.2 fantasy points through 2 games, I'm going to continue to sit him. You're going to, you know, kind of pay the price if he pops off, but I think you have probably a good enough player on your roster that you can afford to sit George Kittle here in week 5. Man, it pays me to say. On the other hand, there's no reason to even discuss the Panthers tight ends. They are all sits, especially against this Niners defense and especially with Baker Mayfield at the quarterback position. All right, Eagles at Cardinals. I'm starting both tight ends in this matchup. This is one of my favorite game scripts of the week, one of my favorite matchups overall, and both these tight ends have played phenomenal in the season. Dallas Goedert is your tight end 8 in full PPR. Week 1, he had just 9 fantasy points, but outside of that, at least 11 fantasy points in every other matchup this year. I absolutely love everything we've seen out of Dallas Goedert. Plus, he's on one of the best offenses in the league. You're starting Goedert if you own him. Zach Ertz, on the other hand, is having a monster season, guys. He's our tight end 4, and I feel like it's been pretty quiet. Not a lot of people are talking about how Ertz has been performing at least 10.5 fantasy points in every matchup so far on the season. 181 receiving yards, 22 receptions, 2 scores. Man, listen, Philly's a great defense. I get it, but I think that the Cardinals are going to keep this game competitive, and Zach Ertz, just the way he's been performing on the season, is a must start on a weekly basis. So I love this game overall from a fantasy perspective. This is one of the better games of the weekend, and I love both tight ends in this matchup moving into week 5. Our Cowboys at Rams. I've got Dalton Schultz as a start. I got an asterisk here because he had 3 targets last week, no receptions. He didn't play week 3, and week 2 he didn't even have a full fantasy point, full PPR. Week 1, he had a good game, 13.2 fantasy points, man. Listen, I think he can bounce back here in week 5. The Rams defense, outside of the run game, like, they have been very, very bad so far on the season. So I think Schultz has a good opportunity here. I've got an asterisk here because if you own Dalton Schultz, especially with him missing week 3, more than likely you have another tight end roster, and you might want to consider that other tight end if you think they're a better option, or maybe if we talked about them in today's video and I gave you that conviction to start them over Dalton Schultz. But I still believe in Schultz on the season, and I think he could have a good game against the Rams here in week 5. Tyler Higbee has been an incredible bright spot for the Rams offense. He is essentially the number 2 option behind Cooper Kupp on this offense. He is Matthew Stafford's like second Reed. So HIGBEE comes in as your tight end 5 in full PPR. Outside of week 1 where he had 8.9 fantasy points, at least 10 fantasy points in every other game this season. He has 38 targets, guys. I mean, it's good overall for the tight end position. There's no touchdowns on the year, and he's tight end 5 in full PPR. There's no reason whatsoever, if you own Tyler Higbee, not to start him. Top 5 tight end, he's in your lineup. It's a steep matchup, I get it, but you're still starting Higbee. It's a steep matchup last week against the Niners, and he had his best fantasy performance of the season. So I like both tight ends in this matchup moving into week 5. Bengals at Ravens. Hayden Hurst is currently dealing with a groin injury, so he really should have an asterisk here. He's your tight end 14 in full PPR. I like this matchup. This is one of the other matchups that I'm a big fan of moving into the weekend from a fantasy perspective. I do think if Hurst is healthy, you can consider him a start. 1.7 points in week 3, but outside of that, 7.4 or more fantasy points in every matchup so far on the season in full PPR. So I like where Hurst is at. Does he have a crazy high ceiling? No, but if you need a tight end streaming option, if you're in a bad enough position, I do think you can consider Hurst a start. And overall, I just think this is a good matchup for Hayden Hurst. He got his first touchdown last week. I wouldn't necessarily expect him to score again, but if he's healthy and he suits up, I do like him in this game script in this matchup overall. Mark Andrews, not a big discussion to have here. He's your tight end 2 overall in full PPR. I get it, a bad week in week 4. He's going to have a couple throughout the year, but he's not going to have many. He's a must start on a weekly basis. There's nothing to discuss here overall. So far, he's got 3 touchdowns on the season, 260 receiving yards, 24 receptions. He's Lamar Jackson's ¡1 target. He's one of the best tight ends in the entire league. Nothing else to discuss here. Mark Andrews is in your starting lineup if you own him. Moving into week 5. All right, Raiders at Chiefs. I like both tight ends in this matchup. Darren Waller moved back from being tight end 5 to tight end 12 after having just 5.4 fantasy points in week 4. But, if you own Darren Waller, you just have to start him on a weekly basis. More than likely, he's the only tight end that you own, and the ceiling is good enough here, like we saw in week 1 at 11.9 fantasy points, in week 2 at 17, that he should be in your starting lineups on a weekly basis. On top of that, I like this game script. I do think the Chiefs are the better team, undoubtedly, but the Raiders, just one of those teams, are going to do everything they can to try and beat you. And in these divisional matchups against a high-scoring offense, they're going to continue throughout this game to try and keep it as competitive as possible. So it's a good game script for a player like Darren Waller here in week 5. Travis Kelce's your tight end 1 overall in full PPR and in standard scoring formats. He's got 322 receiving yards and 3 scores on the year. No discussion to have here. If you own Travis Kelce, you feel pretty good about the tight end position on a weekly basis. We just talked about Mark Andrews. Kelce, Mark Andrews, if you own them, you're starting them. There's nothing else to say. Kelce is a start moving in to week 5. And that'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button if you're new to the channel. It really does help us out when you guys hit that like and consider subscribing. Feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. Drops, ads, starts, sits, trades, roster settings, quarterbacks, running backs, receivers, tight ends, kickers, defense, whatever it may be, let me know. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Make sure to check out all of our links down below. Look out for our next live fantasy Q&A live stream. We would love to have you there as well. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.